His name was Chen Wei. He was 23 years old, and he would never see his home again. This is the story they didn't want you to know. The story of the men who built Canada's most dangerous railway through mountains that seemed designed to kill them. The story of explosions, rock slides, disease, and death. The story of 17,000 Chinese workers who carved a path through solid rock with their hands, their sweat, and their lives. Welcome to the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway. Welcome to 1882. Welcome to hell. Chen Wei arrived in British Columbia in the spring of 1882. He had traveled across the Pacific Ocean from Guangdong Province, crammed into the hold of a steamship with 300 other men. 37 days at sea. 37 days of vomiting, of seasickness, of men dying in the darkness below deck. He was told he would make good money, enough to send home to his family, enough to build a house, enough to marry when he returned. He was not told the truth. The truth was this: Chinese workers were paid $1 a day. White workers were paid $1.50 for the same work. Chinese workers provided their own food, their own tents, their own supplies. White workers had these provided by the company. The truth was this: Chinese workers were given the most dangerous jobs: tunneling through mountains, handling dynamite, working on cliff faces where one wrong step meant death. The truth was this: the Canadian Pacific Railway didn't keep records of Chinese deaths. They didn't count. They didn't matter. They were expendable. Chen Wei didn't know any of this when he stepped off the boat in Victoria. He only knew that he had borrowed money from his entire village to pay for the passage, that his parents were counting on him. That failure was not an option. So he picked up his tools and walked toward the mountains. The journey from Victoria to the construction camps took 3 weeks on foot. Chen Wei walked with a crew of 50 other men. Most were from Guangdong, like him. A few were from Fujian. They spoke different dialects, but understood each other's fear. The path led through forests so thick the sun never reached the ground. It followed rivers that roared with snowmelt even in summer. It climbed hills that left the men gasping for breath, their legs burning, their lungs aching. At night, they slept wherever they could find flat ground. They cooked rice over small fires. They talked about what awaited them in the mountains. The rumors were contradictory. Some said the work was easy and the pay was good. Others whispered about men who had gone and never returned. The foreman who led them was a white man named Jenkins. He didn't speak to the workers. He didn't look at them. He walked ahead, and they followed. On the 12th day, they saw the first body. It was lying by the side of the path, half covered with branches. A Chinese man, young. His face was frozen in an expression of pain. His legs were crushed, probably by a rock. No one had buried him. No one had marked the spot. He was just there, rotting, as if he had been garbage discarded by the roadside. Jenkins didn't stop. "Keep moving," he said. Chen Wei looked at the body as he passed. He tried to see the man's face clearly, to remember it. But the features were already blurred by decay. In a week, there would be nothing left but bones. This was his first lesson about the railway. The dead were not buried. The dead were not mourned. The dead were simply left behind. The work began at dawn. The foreman's whistle cut through the mountain air at 5 in the morning. By 5:30, the men were in position. By 6, they were blasting. The Rocky Mountains stretched endlessly before them. Granite walls rising thousands of feet into the sky. Rivers carving deep canyons through the rock. Snow on the peaks, even in summer. And somewhere in the middle of all this, a railway had to be built. The plan was simple in theory. Blast through the mountains where possible. Build bridges over the canyons. Lay track across the valleys. Connect the Pacific coast to the rest of Canada. The execution was anything but simple. Every mile of track through the mountains required moving tons of rock. Every tunnel required months of drilling, blasting, clearing. Every bridge required engineering that pushed the limits of what was possible. And every day, men died. Chen Wei's first day on the job, he witnessed a death. The blasting crew was working on a tunnel face. They had drilled holes into the rock, packed them with dynamite, lit the fuses. Everyone was supposed to run to safety before the explosion. Liu Jian didn't run fast enough. The blast caught him halfway to the shelter. Rocks the size of horses flew through the air. One of them hit Liu Jian in the back. He went down and didn't get up. The foreman barely paused. "Clear the debris," he said. "Reset the charges." Two men carried Liu Jian's body away. Chen Wei never learned what happened to it. There was no funeral, no ceremony, no marker. Liu Jian simply ceased to exist. Chen Wei went back to work. What else could he do? That night, lying in his tent, Chen Wei couldn't sleep. He kept seeing Liu Jian's face. The surprise, the pain, the sudden absence of life. Liu Jian had been from the same province as Chen Wei. They had talked on the ship. Liu Jian had a wife and 2 children in China. He had shown Chen Wei a photograph, wrinkled and faded from being carried in his pocket for months. A woman with a shy smile. 2 children, a boy and a girl, standing stiffly for the camera. Those children would never see their father again. They would wait for letters that wouldn't come. They would hope for money that wouldn't arrive. Eventually, they would give up. They would assume he had abandoned them, or found a new life in Canada, or simply forgotten. They would never know the truth. That their father was dead. That he died building a railway in a country they couldn't imagine. That his body was thrown into a ravine, or buried in an unmarked hole, or simply left to rot where it fell. Chen Wei thought about his own family. His mother, who had cried when he left. His father, who had pretended not to care, but whose hands had trembled when they said goodbye. His younger siblings, who had looked at him like he was going on a grand adventure. Would they ever know if he died here? He pushed the thought away. There was no time for fear. There was only the work. The dynamite was the worst part. Nitroglycerin, unstable, deadly. The men called it the devil's sweat in Cantonese. One wrong move and it would explode in your hands. One day too hot and it would detonate on its own. One moment of bad luck and you would be scattered across the mountainside in pieces too small to bury. The Chinese workers were given the dynamite jobs, the drilling, the packing, the lighting of fuses. The white workers stood at safe distances and watched. Chen Wei learned to drill by hand, 8 hours a day, swinging a hammer against a steel rod, driving it inch by inch into solid granite. His arms ached, his shoulders screamed, his hands blistered, bled, calloused, blistered again. When the hole was deep enough, he would pack it with dynamite. Carefully, so carefully. One mistake, and the mountain would claim another victim. Then he would light the fuse and run. Sometimes the fuse burned too fast. Sometimes it didn't burn at all, and someone had to go back to check, never knowing if the explosion would come the moment they touched it. Sometimes the explosion was too big, and rocks flew farther than expected, killing men who thought they were safe. In the first month, Chen Wei's crew lost 4 men. In the second month, 3 more. By the end of the summer, He had stopped counting. The nights were almost worse than the days. The workers slept in tents pitched on rocky ground. 10 men to a tent, sometimes 12. No mattresses, no blankets thick enough for the mountain cold, no heat except what their bodies generated. Chen Wei would lie awake, listening to the sounds of the camp. Coughing. Always coughing. Half the men had something in their lungs. The dust from the blasting, the smoke from the fires, the damp cold that never seemed to leave. The food was rice and dried fish, bought with their own money from contractors who charged double what it was worth. No fresh vegetables, no fruit, no meat except on rare occasions. Scurvy was common. So was dysentery. So was simple starvation. The men talked about home, about their villages in Guangdong, about the wives they had left behind, about the children they might never see. They talked about the money they were saving, the money they were sending home, the houses they would build when they returned. Most of them would never return. Chen Wei shared his tent with 9 other men. He learned their names, their stories, their fears. There was Wang Fei, a farmer from a village near Chen Wei's. He was 42, the oldest in the tent, and he moved slowly, his joints aching from decades of work in the fields. He had come to Canada because his farm had failed, destroyed by floods 3 years in a row. There was Li Ming, barely 18, who had never been away from home before. He cried at night when he thought no one could hear. He wrote letters to his mother every week, even though the mail took months to arrive. There was Zhang Wei, who never talked about his past. He had scars on his back that looked like whip marks. He flinched when the foreman raised his voice. There was old Huang, who claimed to have been a scholar before he lost everything gambling. He could read and write, which made him valuable. He kept track of the money the men were owed, scratching numbers into a piece of wood. There was Chen Tao, no relation to Chen Wei, despite sharing a surname. He was strong, stronger than anyone else in the camp. He could swing a hammer for 12 hours without stopping. But his strength wouldn't save him. He would die in November, crushed by a falling beam in a tunnel collapse. There was Liu Wei, who had a laugh that could be heard across the camp. He found humor in everything, even the death, even the cold. His laughter died with him when a premature explosion took his life in January. There was Wang Jun, who spoke no English at all and barely spoke Cantonese. He was from somewhere in the north. No one knew how he had ended up here. He worked silently, ate silently, slept silently. One morning, he simply wasn't there. His tent mates assumed he had died in the night and been taken away. No one ever asked. There was Zhao Ming, who had been a sailor before this. He knew how to tie knots and read the weather. He survived the railway only to drown in the Fraser River 2 years later. And there was Chen Wei, who would outlive them all. The canyon work was the most terrifying. Where the mountains dropped into deep gorges, bridges had to be built. But before the bridges could be built, the rock face had to be prepared. And the only way to prepare it was to send men down on ropes, dangling hundreds of feet above the river, drilling holes for dynamite. Chen Wei did this work twice. Both times, he thought he was going to die. The rope was thin. The harness was made of leather that creaked ominously. The rock face was slick with moisture, and below, far below, the river roared over rocks that would crush a man like an insect. He drilled his holes. He packed his dynamite. He lit his fuse. He was hauled up just in time. The explosion sent rocks cascading into the canyon. The sound echoed off the walls for what seemed like minutes. When the dust cleared, there was a small ledge where before there had been only vertical cliff. progress, inch by painful inch. The men who did the canyon work were called basket men because they were lowered in wicker baskets. The baskets were flimsy. The ropes were frayed. Every descent was a gamble with death. Chen Wei watched 3 men die doing canyon work. One fell when his rope snapped. He screamed all the way down, a sound that seemed to last forever, until it stopped suddenly when he hit the rocks. Another was killed by flying debris from a blast that went off too soon. The third simply let go. No one knew if it was an accident or intentional. By the end of the summer, some men were choosing to die rather than face another day. Suicide was not uncommon. The company never acknowledged it. When a man threw himself from a cliff or walked into a river and didn't come out, the official cause of death was accident. The railway couldn't admit that conditions were so terrible that workers would rather die than continue. But Chen Wei saw it. Saw men who stopped eating. Saw men who walked into blizzards without coats. Saw men who lit fuses and didn't run. The mountain took everyone eventually. The only question was how. The winter of 1882 was brutal. Snow fell in October and didn't stop until April. Temperatures dropped to -40. Men who had come from southern China had never experienced cold like this. Their thin clothes were useless. Their tents collapsed under the weight of snow. Their fires couldn't keep them warm. Work continued anyway. The Canadian Pacific Railway had a deadline. The government had promised to complete the line within 10 years. Investors were watching. Every day of delay cost money. Every day of delay meant angry telegrams from Ottawa. So the men worked in snow up to their waists. They worked in blizzards that reduced visibility to 10 feet. They worked with fingers so numb they couldn't feel the dynamite they were handling. Chen Wei saw a man lose his fingers that winter. Frostbite. His hands turned black. Then the smell came. The company doctor, who rarely visited the Chinese camps, amputated what remained with a saw. No anesthetic. The man's screams echoed through the mountains for hours. He went back to work the next week. What choice did he have? The camp had no doctor for Chinese workers. The company doctor served the white workers only. When Chinese men got sick or injured, they had to rely on traditional medicine or simply hope for the best. Old Huang knew some herbal remedies. He gathered plants from the forest, brewed them into bitter teas. Sometimes they helped, often they didn't. When a man was too injured to work, he was put on half rations. When a man was too injured to walk, he was left behind as the crews moved on. The company had no obligation to care for workers who couldn't work. Chen Wei saw men crawl after the moving camp, desperate not to be abandoned. Saw men with broken legs dragging themselves through the snow. Saw men die alone in empty tents, their bodies not discovered until spring. The company called it efficiency. The workers called it murder. But they kept working. Because stopping meant starving. Because going home meant admitting failure. Because the debts they had taken on to come here would follow them forever if they didn't repay them. They were trapped. Trapped by money. Trapped by distance. Trapped by a system designed to extract everything from them while giving nothing back. The death toll mounted. No one kept exact records. The Canadian Pacific Railway certainly didn't. But the estimates would later suggest that for every mile of track through the mountains, 4 Chinese workers died. Some said more. Some said the true number was so high that even the estimates were too low. They died in explosions. They died in rock slides. They died falling from cliffs. They died of disease. They died of cold. They died of malnutrition. They died of injuries that would have been survivable with proper medical care. And when they died, their bodies were often left where they fell, in the tunnels, in the canyons, under the rubble. There was no time to recover them. There was no one to notify. There was no one who cared. Chen Wei stopped making friends. What was the point? They would be dead within months. Better to keep his head down, do his work, survive. Survival was all that mattered now. The letters from home came slowly. It took months for mail to travel from Guangdong province to the construction camps in British Columbia. By the time Chen Wei received news from his family, it was already ancient history. His mother wrote that his father was ill. His sister wrote that the crops had failed. His brother wrote that they needed more money, always more money. Chen Wei sent what he could, which wasn't much. After paying for his food, his supplies, his share of the tent, he had maybe 15 cents a day left. He saved it, coin by coin, and sent it home every few months. It was never enough. He wanted to tell them the truth, to describe the explosions, the deaths, the cold that made his bones ache, the fear that followed him every moment of every day. But he couldn't. They wouldn't understand. They would worry. And what good would their worry do? So he wrote about the mountains, the beauty of them, the eagles that circled overhead, the rivers that ran clear and cold. He made it sound like an adventure. He made it sound like he was happy. Spring came slowly. The snow began to melt in April. The rivers swelled with runoff. The mountainsides became deadly with avalanches and mudslides. Men who had survived the winter died in the thaw, buried under tons of snow that came crashing down without warning. But the work continued. Always, the work continued. The tunnels were the focus now. The Kicking Horse Pass required tunnels that would take months to complete. The Rogers Pass was even worse. Solid granite. No easy path. Just drill and blast, day after day, week after week. Chen Wei worked the tunnel crews that spring. The darkness was almost a relief after the blinding white of winter. Inside the mountain, there was no wind, no snow, just rock and dust and the endless rhythm of hammers against steel. But the tunnels had their own dangers, cave-ins. The rock was unstable in places, and supports could fail without warning. Chen Wei saw a section collapse that killed 6 men. They were buried alive, screaming, and there was nothing anyone could do. By the time the rubble was cleared, they were silent. Bad air. The deeper the tunnel went, the harder it became to breathe. The air was thick with dust and smoke. Men coughed constantly. Some coughed blood. The company did nothing, and always the dynamite. In enclosed spaces, the explosions were even more dangerous. The shockwave had nowhere to go. The rocks had nowhere to fly except toward the workers. Chen Wei learned to read the mountain, to feel when the rock was stable and when it wasn't, to sense when a blast would be clean and when it would bring down the ceiling. This intuition, this feeling, kept him alive when others died. He didn't understand it. He just trusted it. The tunnels were also where the men found moments of strange peace. When work stopped for meals, they would sit in the darkness, eating rice from tin bowls, talking in low voices. The tunnel walls muffled sounds from outside. For a few minutes, they could almost forget where they were. They told stories. Old Huang would recite poetry from memory, classical verses about mountains and rivers and home. Li Ming would describe his village in such detail that the others could almost see it. Jiang Wei would sometimes speak about a woman he had loved before whatever had happened to give him those scars. Chen Wei listened more than he talked. He was storing these moments, he realized, saving them for later, as if he knew that someday, when this was all over, The memories would matter. They sang sometimes. Cantonese folk songs that echoed through the tunnel. Songs about fishermen and farmers, about mothers and lovers, about the villages they had left behind. The white foreman hated the singing. They said it was distracting, that it slowed down the work. But when they weren't looking, the men sang anyway. Music was one of the few things the railway couldn't take from them. The summer of 1883 brought disease. Typhoid swept through the camps. Men who had survived explosions and avalanches died shaking with fever in their tents. The company doctor was overwhelmed. There weren't enough supplies. There wasn't enough clean water. Chen Wei got sick in July. The fever came first, then the chills, then the diarrhea that left him too weak to stand. For 2 weeks, he lay in his tent, barely conscious, waiting to die. He didn't die. He never knew why. Some men recovered. Most didn't. It was just luck. When he finally stood again, he was 30 pounds lighter. His clothes hung on him like rags. His legs trembled when he walked. But he was alive. He went back to work 3 days later. The foreman didn't ask if he was ready. The foreman didn't care. The accidents blurred together after a while. The man who lost his arm when a charge exploded too soon. The man who fell from a bridge and survived, somehow, only to die of his injuries a week later. The man who was crushed by a rolling rock the size of a wagon. The man who went into a tunnel and never came out. Chen Wei stopped reacting to death. It was too common, too ordinary. Death was just another part of the job, like the drilling and the blasting and the endless, endless rock. He wondered sometimes if he had become less human, if the mountains had taken something from him that he would never get back. But he pushed those thoughts away. There was no time for philosophy. There was only the work. Drill, blast, clear, repeat. Drill, blast, clear, repeat. Mile by mile, the railway advanced. By the fall of 1883, the worst sections were almost complete. The tunnels through the Rogers Pass were done. The bridges over the canyons were in place. The track crews were laying steel as fast as the grading crews could prepare the ground. Chen Wei had survived. Against all odds, against all logic, he had survived. But survival came at a cost. He was not the same man who had stepped off the boat in Victoria 18 months before. That man had been young, hopeful, full of dreams about the future. This man was old before his time. His hair was streaked with gray. His face was lined with scars. His eyes had seen too much. He had stopped writing to his family. What was there to say? I'm still alive. That was all. Just alive. Of the 9 men who had shared Chen Wei's tent at the beginning, only 3 were still alive. Wang Fei had died of pneumonia. Li Ming had been killed in a rock slide. Jiang Wei had walked into a blizzard and never returned. Old Huang had simply stopped waking up one morning, his body giving out after 70 years of hard life. Chen Tao was crushed in the tunnel collapse. Liu Wei died in the premature explosion. Wang Jun disappeared. Zhao Ming was reassigned to another crew and never seen again. Chen Wei was one of the survivors. He didn't know why. Luck? Skill? The intuition that told him when to run, when to duck, when to stay away from a section of tunnel that felt wrong? He had become something of a legend among the workers. The man who couldn't die. The one the mountain couldn't kill. Some of the younger workers touched him for luck before dangerous jobs, as if his survival was contagious. But Chen Wei knew the truth. He wasn't special. He wasn't protected. He was just lucky. And luck runs out eventually. Every morning, he woke up wondering if this would be the day his luck ended. Somehow, it never did. The railway was completed in November 1885. The last spike was driven at Craigellachie, British Columbia. Politicians and businessmen posed for photographs. Speeches were made. The Canadian Pacific Railway was called a triumph of engineering, a testament to human achievement, a nation-building accomplishment. No Chinese workers were present for the ceremony. They were not invited. They were not mentioned. Their contribution was erased as completely as their deaths had been ignored. Chen Wei heard about the completion from a foreman. "Job's done," the man said. "You can go home now." Home. Chen Wei wasn't sure he remembered what home meant anymore. The aftermath was cruel. Once the railway was complete, the Canadian government no longer needed Chinese workers. So they passed a law, the Chinese Immigration Act of 1885, a $50 head tax on every Chinese person entering Canada. Later, they would raise it to $500. Later still, they would ban Chinese immigration altogether. The men who had built the railway were suddenly unwelcome in the country they had helped create. Chen Wei couldn't afford to stay. He couldn't afford to leave. He was trapped in a country that didn't want him, with no money, no prospects, no future. Some men found work in the cities, laundries, restaurants, menial jobs that paid next to nothing. Some men died, unable to adjust to a life after the mountains. Some men just disappeared, their fates unknown. Chen Wei stayed in British Columbia for another decade. He worked odd jobs. He saved what he could. He never married. He never built the house he had dreamed about. In 1895, he finally had enough money to return to China. He was 36 years old. He looked 60. The years in Canada had changed him in ways he didn't fully understand until he tried to leave. He couldn't sleep without the sound of other men breathing nearby. Silence terrified him. In the city, he would wake at every noise, his heart pounding, expecting an explosion or a cave-in. He flinched at sudden movements. He couldn't stand loud sounds. The whistle of a train made him want to run. The crack of a whip sent him back to the tunnels, to the darkness, to the endless rhythm of hammers against steel. He had nightmares, dreams of falling from canyon walls, dreams of fire and rock and screaming men, dreams of Liu Jian's face, of old Huang's face, of all the faces of men who had died while he survived. He had survived. But survival had cost him something essential, some part of himself that he could never get back. He had become a ghost before he died. A man who walked through the world but was no longer fully part of it. A man who carried the mountains inside him, their weight pressing down on his soul. The journey home was nothing like the journey out. This time, Chen Wei had a cabin instead of the hold. This time, he had clean clothes and decent food. This time, he survived the crossing without seeing a single death. But as the ship approached the coast of China, Chen Wei felt nothing. No joy, no relief, just emptiness. His village had changed in 13 years. His parents were dead. His siblings had moved away. The house he had grown up in was occupied by strangers who didn't know his name. He had sent money home, faithfully, every few months. But it hadn't been enough. His family had sold the land to pay debts. They had scattered across the province looking for work. They had forgotten him. Chen Wei wandered through his village like a ghost. No one recognized him. No one remembered the young man who had left for Canada so many years ago. He had given everything to the railway. His youth, his health, his hope. And in return, he had received nothing. Not even the right to stay in the country he had helped build. Chen Wei died in 1912 at the age of 53. He died in a small room in Guangzhou, alone. His body was found 3 days later by a landlord collecting rent. There was no family to notify, no one to mourn him. He was cremated, and his ashes were placed in a common grave with hundreds of others. No marker, no ceremony, no record of his existence beyond a brief entry in a government ledger. He had survived the mountains, but the mountains had taken everything from him anyway. The Canadian Pacific Railway became one of the most important infrastructure projects in Canadian history. It united a nation. It opened the West to settlement. It made fortunes for investors and built cities from nothing. Politicians called it Canada's greatest achievement. But the men who built it were forgotten. 17,000 Chinese workers came to Canada to work on the railway. Estimates suggest that between 600 and 2,000 of them died during construction. The true number is probably higher. We will never know exactly how many, because no one bothered to count. Their names are lost. Their faces are forgotten. Their graves are unmarked. They exist only in the railway itself, in every mile of track through the mountains, in every tunnel and bridge and retaining wall. They built Canada, and Canada forgot them. In 2006, the Canadian government officially apologized to the Chinese-Canadian community for the head tax and for decades of discriminatory policies. The Prime Minister called it a grave injustice. It was more than a century too late for Chen Wei. Too late for Liu Jian, who died on Chen Wei's first day. Too late for the thousands of others who gave their lives for a railway that brought them nothing but suffering. An apology cannot bring back the dead, cannot restore the years lost, cannot undo the damage done, but it can acknowledge the truth. And the truth is this: the Canadian Pacific Railway was built on the backs of Chinese workers. It was built with their sweat, their blood, their lives. It was built by men who were treated as less than human, paid less than half of what white workers earned, given the most dangerous jobs, and then erased from history. They deserve to be remembered. The next time you take a train through the Rocky Mountains, think about Chen Wei. Think about the men who drilled through solid granite with their hands. Think about the men who handled dynamite, knowing that any moment could be their last. Think about the men who froze in winter, starved in summer, and died in numbers too large to count. Think about the names that were never recorded, the faces that were never photographed, the stories that were never told. They are there, in the mountains, in the rock, in the iron rails that carry you through landscapes that seem impossibly beautiful. Their ghosts ride every train that passes through the Rogers Pass. Their spirits echo in every tunnel carved through stone. Chen Wei was 23 when he arrived in Canada. He had dreams of wealth, of success, of building a life for his family. Instead, he found hell. He found death all around him. He found a country that used him and then discarded him. But he also found something else. He found strength he didn't know he had. He found the ability to survive when survival seemed impossible. He found the courage to face each day, knowing it might be his last. That courage deserves to be honored. That strength deserves to be remembered. Those lives, lost and forgotten, deserve to be acknowledged. The mountains still stand. The snow still falls in winter. The rivers still run through the canyons. The eagles still circle overhead. The landscape looks almost exactly as it did in 1882, when Chen Wei first saw it. But now, trains run through those mountains. Thousands of trains every year, carrying passengers and freight across the country that Chen Wei helped build. Every one of those trains travels on track laid over the bones of men who were never given proper burials. Every one of those trains passes through tunnels blasted by hands that no longer exist. The Canadian Pacific Railway is a monument, but it is not a monument to progress or engineering or nation building. It is a monument to human suffering, to exploitation, to the price that some must pay so that others can prosper. Chen Wei knew this. He learned it in the tunnels. He learned it on the cliff faces. He learned it watching his friends die, one after another, while the foreman called for more work. He learned that some lives are valued and some are not. He learned that history is written by those who survive, and that those who build the world are often erased from it. This is the story of Chen Wei. It is also the story of 17,000 other men whose names we will never know. Men who left their homes for a chance at a better life. Men who found instead a mountain of rock that had to be moved, one explosion at a time. Men who died so that a railway could be built. They were not heroes. They did not choose to sacrifice themselves. They were simply men trying to survive, trying to earn money, trying to go home. Most of them never made it, but their work remains. Every mile of track, every tunnel, every bridge, built by hands that have been dust for over a century, built by men who were told their lives didn't matter. They did matter. They still matter. And now, you know their story. Remember them. The next time you complain about your job, think about Chen Wei. Think about waking before dawn in a tent that offers no protection from the cold. Think about drilling holes in solid rock for 8 hours straight. Think about handling explosives that could kill you at any moment. Think about watching your friends die and being told to get back to work. Think about earning $1 a day for work that would kill you before you could spend it. Think about sending that money home to a family you might never see again. Think about surviving, somehow, against all odds, only to find yourself unwanted in the country you helped create. That was Chen Wei's life. That was the life of thousands of men like him. They didn't have a choice. They had debts to pay, families to support, dreams that seemed possible until they stepped into the mountains. We have choices they never had, opportunities they never knew, comforts they couldn't imagine. The least we can do is remember them. His name was Chen Wei. He was 23 years old when he came to Canada. He was 36 when he left. He was 53 when he died. In between, he helped build a railway that changed a nation. He watched men die by the dozens. He survived things that would break most people. He returned home to find that home no longer existed. He was never wealthy, never famous, never acknowledged. He lived and died in obscurity. One of millions of people whose lives made the modern world possible, but whose names will never appear in history books. But now, you know his name. Chen Wei. Remember it.